Imagine a man so powerful, so dominant, that for 13 straight years, not a single opponent could score a point on him. Now picture that same monster stepping into the UFC octagon. Joe Rogan says, everyone would be smashed. This isn't hype. This is Alexander Karelin, the scariest wrestler to ever walk the earth. And what if, just what if, he had fought in the UFC? During episode number 2012 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Rogan brought up Alexander Karelin in a conversation with psychologist Gad Saad, describing him as one of the most intimidating combat athletes of all time. Rogan didn't hold back. He speculated that if Karelin had ever transitioned seriously into MMA, particularly the UFC heavyweight division, the entire roster would have been in serious trouble. In his words, if he did fight MMA, everyone would be smashed. He emphasized that Karelin's sheer physicality, combined with his elite wrestling pedigree, would make him an unstoppable force in the octagon. According to Rogan, the UFC has seen dominant wrestlers before, like Khabib Nurmagomedov, Daniel Cormier, and Cain Velasquez, but Karelin was operating on another level. He was not just a champion, but an athletic anomaly. Rogan theorized that if Karelin had also learned how to strike effectively, he could have become one of the most terrifying heavyweights in MMA history. His tone was equal parts admiration and awe, painting a picture of what could have been a mythical presence in modern MMA. Joe Rogan pointed out that although Alexander Karelin technically had an MMA fight, it wasn't exactly the real deal. He referred to it as a Fugazi MMA fight that took place in Japan, implying that the match was more of a performance than a true test of MMA skill. According to Rogan, Japan during that era was known for blurring the lines between MMA and professional wrestling, often staging fights that were presented as legitimate but had predetermined outcomes or heavily controlled dynamics. Rogan explained that Karelin's sole MMA appearance seemed like one of those hybrid spectacles. It's kind of pro wrestling but kind of not, one of those deals, he said. He added that Karelin was likely paid a large sum of money just to appear, not to actually compete in a full-contact, unscripted bout. Because of this, Rogan dismissed that fight as an unreliable measure of Karelin's potential in actual MMA. Despite the match's questionable authenticity, the very fact that Japan wanted Karelin speaks volumes about his reputation and aura. He was a global icon in wrestling, and promoters knew his name would draw attention. But as Rogan stressed, don't look at that one fight and assume it represents what Karelin could have done in the UFC. Joe Rogan couldn't stop marveling at Karelin's freakish athleticism. He described the Russian wrestling legend as something beyond human, calling him the Experiment, a nickname Karelin earned due to his superhuman strength, control, and conditioning. Rogan emphasized that Karelin wasn't just big. He was explosive, coordinated, and unusually agile for a man of his size. To illustrate Karelin's unnatural ability, Rogan pulled up a video of him walking across the floor on his shoulders, not on his feet or hands, but literally bouncing along the mat using only his traps and neck strength. That level of control and body awareness at over 280 pounds is almost unheard of, especially in combat sports. Rogan also pointed out that Karelin could manhandle other world-class athletes, picking them up and slamming them with ease. In Greco-Roman wrestling, where leg attacks are illegal and upper body control is everything, Karelin was so dominant that opponents often looked helpless. It wasn't just raw power. His flexibility, explosiveness, and timing allowed him to ragdoll men who themselves were elite competitors. Rogan framed Karelin as a once-in-a-lifetime physical specimen who had the tools to become an unstoppable force if he'd ever transitioned fully to MMA. Joe Rogan emphasized that Alexander Karelin wasn't just great, he was statistically one of the most dominant athletes in the history of any sport. Over the span of his legendary Greco-Roman wrestling career, Karelin amassed a staggering record of 887 wins with only 2 losses. Let that sink in. Nearly 900 matches and only 2 defeats. That kind of consistency at the elite level is almost unfathomable. He was a 3-time Olympic gold medalist, and his loss in the 2000 Sydney Olympics final to American Rulon Gardner was such a shock that it's still considered one of the biggest upsets in Olympic history. Until then, Karelin had gone 13 years undefeated, and during one stretch of that time, he went 6 straight years without giving up a single point. Not a single one. His opponents weren't just losing, they were being completely shut out. Rogan pointed to this track record as hard evidence that Karelin was operating on a completely different level. He wasn't just beating the best in the world, he was dominating them physically, mentally, and technically. If you translated even a fraction of that dominance into the octagon, you'd be looking at a heavyweight who could have potentially run through the UFC division. That record alone is enough to solidify Carolyn as a mythic figure, and it adds serious weight to Rogan's speculation about his potential in MMA. Joe Rogan didn't just talk about Carolyn with respect, he talked about him with near reverence. In fact, Rogan revealed that he has a printed picture of Alexander Karelin in his personal space, serving as a constant reminder of the Russians' sheer dominance and toughness. But in true Rogan fashion, he framed it with humor, saying the photo reminds him of what I am ***. That statement, while funny, really captures how Rogan and many combat sports fans view Carolyn as the gold standard of physical and mental toughness. Rogan, who has trained in martial arts for decades and interviewed some of the baddest fighters on the planet, still sees Carolyn as a humbling figure. That alone speaks volumes. To Rogan, Carolyn represents something beyond just athletic excellence. He symbolizes what's possible when genetic gifts meet unrelenting discipline. The fact that he keeps a visual of Carolyn as motivation shows how deeply Carolyn's legacy resonates, not just in the wrestling world, but across all of combat sports. It's not every day that someone like Rogan, surrounded by fighters and legends, is in awe. But Carolyn earned that awe, not just through victories, but by being an icon of raw, terrifying dominance.